your seats. Little test to see who was listening back in 1969. Jimi Hendrix used to sing, "Hey Joe, where are you going with that gun in your hand?" Anyone know where Joe was going? Anyone know? He was going to shoot his old lady. That's right. He caught her messing around with another man. And then Hendrix adds, "And that ain't cool." So there's a bit of cultural history for you. Last song sung at Woodstock, 1969 apparently. It was about kind of 9 or 10 in the morning, I think. Things had gone on a bit past my bedtime. But anyway, Hendrix sings this song. And it's one of those songs that captures the emotion of betrayal. Actually, when you listen to it, it's a powerful song. And it's that theme that carries through all kinds of songs, plenty of country ballads, the themes of all sorts of thrillers and other movies, and of course soap operas. We see this all around us. Infidelity, one person cheating on another, a lack of trust. Maybe some of you will have experienced that firsthand. You'll know that feeling from your own personal life. And the prophet Hosea draws on that, or rather God draws on that theme through him to teach his people long ago about their spiritual state. And the prophet really in this book of Hosea is exploring and coming to conclusions about whether God is like Joe. When God is betrayed, when God is cheated on, when, as it were, to use the imagery of this book, God finds Israel messing around with another woman, does he reach for his shotgun and load it and blow his lover's brains out? Or does God respond differently? That's the question of this book. And hopefully as you started last week and as we continue this week, we'll see that God is very different to the jealous lover who responds in violence. We'll see how this pans out in this chapter. And we're going to look bit by bit through what happens here. How does God respond? Just to set the scene, in case you missed last week, Hosea is a prophet in the northern part of Israel when it was divided into two kingdoms. He's teaching at a time when God's people had gone right off the rails. Religiously speaking, in all kinds of other ways, they distanced themselves from God. They'd forgotten all about God, and they were worshipping these other gods, false gods. And Hosea is called to give a painful message to them, to tell them that this is spiritual adultery and that they are guilty. But Hosea goes way further than any other Old Testament prophet in terms of embodying his message. There are people like Ezekiel, ever in Ezekiel? Ezekiel kind of acts out this message he's given. He chops bits of his hair off and he lies on one side, the other side, and has this kind of barbecue on his own poo and burns the hair. It's very strange. It's kind of like conceptual art for the Old Testament. And he acts this all out to embody the message. But Hosea goes a step further. Hosea, as we saw last week, is called by God to marry a woman who he knows will cheat on him. She is promiscuous. He knows that she won't be faithful to him and that she will break his heart again and again. And as people walked around the town where Hosea lived and they saw his wife out with another man or going home with another man, they were meant to twig that this is exactly how they've been treating God. That God, the faithful husband, has been let down, has been cheated upon time and time again by his unfaithful bride, Israel. That was the message. And this kind of crossover between the personal life of Hosea and his wife Gomer and what this represents, the religious life of Israel and their God, it sort of intertwines again in this next chapter as God really is speaking to his people Israel. So let's look at verse 2. And as Molly said, this is not comfortable reading. If you read this and you think, oh, okay, fair enough. Verses 2 to 5 of chapter 2, nothing much. Then something's wrong with you, okay? You're supposed to be woken up by these verses. They are shocking, okay? So let's just look at them again, in case you missed it the first time. Verse 2 of chapter 2 in Hosea. Rebuke your mother, rebuke her, for she is not my wife, and I am not her husband. Let her remove the adulterous look from her face and the unfaithfulness from between her breasts. Otherwise I will strip her naked and make her as bare as on the day she was born. I will make her like a desert, turn her into a parched land, and slay her with thirst. I will not show my love to her children, because they are the children of adultery. Their mother has been unfaithful, and she has conceived them in disgrace. She said, I will go after my lovers, who give me my food and my water, my wool and my linen, my olive oil and my drink. These opening verses of tonight's passage are meant to be an indictment of the state that Israel had got into. But the words are shocking, aren't they? Especially when we hear those words proceeding from the mouth of God. I think that's what makes them the hardest to hear. We kind of feel as though God shouldn't talk like this. I don't know, maybe it's just me, but I felt uncomfortable reading these words, uncomfortable thinking through how I was going to present this evening. It is a bit uncomfortable preaching this passage. Anyone want to swap? Maybe? No? Okay. But because these words, they feel, they're quite disturbing actually, aren't they? The image of a husband stripping naked his wife in view of everybody else. I mean, how does that fit into our framework of the loving God revealed in Jesus Christ? That's the question that's been going through my head most of this week. And we're meant to be alarmed by this, I think. Hosea is conjuring up a shocking image that is meant to grab the attention of the people who heard this. It's supposed to shake them from their apathy and from their spiritual adultery. And I think there's a bunch of things going on here which Hosea is drawing on, which they would have understood actually in their culture, which we are a bit more distant from, and it's hard for us to get. So what is, particularly in verse 3, what is Hosea getting at here? There's a few things happening here. In the ancient Near East, that's what scholars use to describe that kind of region where Israel was. There was a practice like this that seems to be fairly commonplace. If a woman was caught as a serial adulterer or caught in prostitution, this would happen to her at the city gate. She would be stripped naked, often by her children, actually, not by her husband, almost to expose her sin. That was kind of symbolically what was happening there. Now, there's no evidence we can find that this happened in Israel. It may have done. Israel seemed to be pretty syncretistic in all kinds of ways, taking on board stuff from the cultures around them. So we don't know. But there's no archaeological or sort of written evidence of this happening there. But we know certainly in the cultures around, this would happen. This is a way that a family or even a community would shame someone who had been involved in this kind of sin. And so this image, which would have been familiar, I guess, to the Israelites, is brought in to wake them up to their situation. They are like this woman. Also, it's worth noting that this kind of language was used when a big bad king was upset with one of the little kings who was kind of near him. The kings would make treaties. And so if you're the big bad king, you make treaties with the little sort of scrawny kings. And sometimes they would fail on their treaties and they would do things they weren't supposed to do. They would go behind your back or something. And then you could expect a letter that reads very much like the language here that God uses, from the big bad king to the little king, describing what will happen to them. And often the king, this supposed mighty warrior, is described as a woman. It's supposed to be humiliating language. And it points to the fact that military kind of terror is coming their way. They're going to be destroyed on the battlefield. That's what this kind of letter would point to. I've read a few of them this week from that part of the world, from this time in history. And so it seems to be a few things going on here. And of course, there's the connection as well to what we see later in verse 4. Later on in verse 3. This image of being stripped naked, I think, is picture language for what is going to happen to the agricultural system in their country. Look at the tail end of verse 3. I will make her like a desert. I will turn her into a parched land. I will slay her with thirst. In other words, all the crops and the harvest and the rains and everything else are going to cease. They're going to be hungry. And so Hosea is kind of mixing together all these different metaphors here to try and portray to them what is going to happen. Spiritual disaster, military disaster, agricultural or food security disaster. This is the picture for God's people if they continue on the road which they're on. It's meant to wake them up. It's meant to be shocking. God is using some of the grimmest images from society around them to point out just how grim their situation is. And so, as I said, the question in this passage really is, how does God respond then? if they have committed this adultery, what is God's next move? And we're going to see in the sections that come after this how God responds. But before we get there, let's just explore, press in a bit deeper to what the problem was here. The problem in these passages sums up pretty well for us in verse 5. Did you see it as I read? They've been unfaithful. They have kind of, as it were, committed adultery or gone out and offered themselves with no reason to as prostitutes. Now, of course, we know that in our culture, a lot of people involved in prostitution, they don't choose it. They are victims as much as anything else. But like a lot of the parables of Jesus and other images you find in the prophets, they're really just picking on one aspect of an image. They want to draw one thing out to your attention. I think the thing that we're drawing out here is a person who has no reason to enter into prostitution, but is completely, what's the word? It's infidelity. That's what we have here. They've turned their back on a loving husband, and they revel in what is going on here. Now, perhaps such a person doesn't exist in real life, but in the imagination of the prophet here, that kind of prostitution is what he's talking about. This woman chooses this life. She chooses to go after her lovers. And these lovers are the Baals, gods from the foreign countries around them that they were supposed to steer clear of. And what's the big problem? Well, look at the end, second half of verse 5. They say this about the Baals, about these gods. I will go after my lovers, the gods, who give me my food and my water, my wool, my linen, etc. The problem is that they are attributing to these gods what should only be attributed to the God, to Yahweh. He is the creator. He is the sustainer. He is the source of everything, of life. Nothing breathes or moves or anything without him. He gives them everything they need. He always has done. What a faithful God he has been to them. But when they have a good harvest, what do they say? Praise be to Baal. Thank you, Baal, for giving us these crops. Thank you, Baal, for the rains. Thank you, Baal, for the corn. Thank you, Baal, for the olive oil. That's the form of adultery that we have here. And we could be very quick, couldn't we, I guess, kind of sophisticated Bournemouthites in the 21st century to think, oh, these silly ancient people, what are they thinking? I mean, hands up if you've got a statue to Baal in your back garden. Anyone? No? None of you? Anyone bow down to it or sacrifice to it this afternoon? It's a bit wet for that, isn't it? But even if you did, and you probably don't. Because we think we're far beyond this. We're sophisticated now. We are modern. We're past all these things. But as we've often talked about in our preaching at Lansdowne, we're not all that far from that ancient practice of sacrificing to an idol, are we? Our idols are more subtle. They're more modern, but they're there all the same, aren't they? If their problem is that they attribute to something else all their security, their affluence, their comfort, their pleasant situation, and they should attribute it to God, then actually we can fall into that situation, can't we? When you rely on a job because your career is the thing that keeps you going. It's the thing that pays the bills. It's the thing that gets you from kind of one pay packet to the next. It's your career. Or maybe you put all your stock in a relationship. You think, well, if I had that relationship, if I had that person, and she said yes, and then we would go kind of skipping through cornfields, and we'd be very happy, and it'd be happy ever after. Our lives would be perfect. We put all our stock in that as though that is going to bring us satisfaction. Of course it doesn't. I mean, you can go through 101 other examples of where modern people build for themselves an idol. When they bow down and worship it, it becomes the main thing, the only thing in life. It becomes for them the source of all meaning and purpose and security in life. And God is a distant memory. It's exactly what was going on here. So how does God respond? Well, this chapter is quite easy to navigate because each section is introduced with the word therefore. So can you see in verse 6? God says, therefore, and then in verse 9 we get another therefore, and then in 14 we get one more therefore. And each of these will help us to navigate through and to see how God responds, kind of the structure of this little tiny chapter here. And so what's the first thing that God does when he sees people in this awful state of spiritual adultery? In verse 6, let's read on. Therefore I will block her path with thorn bushes. I will wall her in so that she cannot find her way. She will chase after her lovers, but not catch them. She will look for them, but not find them. Then she will say, I will go back to my husband as at first, for then I was better off than now. She has not acknowledged that I was the one who gave her the grain, the new wine, the oil, and who lavished on her silver and gold, which they used for Baal." What is God's response? God's response when people reject him and make something else, a little counterfeit God in their life, is to block them. I think that might be Siri in my pocket. Oh dear, apologies about that. Not sure what's going on there. I will turn my phone off in future. Anyway, their problem is, what God does is he blocks their path. He blocks their path so that they cannot get to where they're going. They try everything to get to the Baal. They try to make their way to his temple. And we're not sure how exactly this happened in the days of Hosea, how exactly God blocked them. But somehow or another, God rerouted them. A bit like what sounded like a sat-nav in my pocket. He reroutes them and takes them a different route so that they cannot get to where they want to go. And actually, God does this in his grace all the time for us. Maybe you can look back and you see that the mercy of God in redirecting you. Perhaps you went for a job and you were passed over for that job. But actually it was the mercy of God that you didn't get that job. That would have been a whole lot of temptation coming your way had you been in that environment or given that kind of prestigious title. Or maybe you move around at work and you're put on that side of the office as opposed to on that side of the office next to her. And over there, that could have meant all kinds of temptation for you. But praise God, he redirected you here. You see, the thing is, the human heart is terrible, isn't it? And we're constantly tempted in this direction or that direction or the other. And God actually in his mercy is redirecting his people here away from this. He blocks their path. He kind of puts hedges up and things to protect us from things which otherwise would be catastrophic for us. He moves us away from sin. And you may think that here or in any other circumstance, maybe God's just being petty in all of this. In kind of our modern way of thinking, if someone chooses this God over that God, then what place is it of that God to step in and say no? Why should God have the right to redirect me? If I want to go this way, I should be able to go that way. If I want to go this way, God shouldn't be able to stop me. But as I was thinking this week, I thought of at least 3 reasons why God is bang on to stop and to redirect people when they head towards sin. The first one, in this chapter, in this circumstance, is that Baal doesn't exist, okay? That's pretty important, right? They are trying to worship something that is not a god. It's just a bit of wood that has been carved into a funny shape. And they go and they give their money and they sacrifice their time. You read in other parts of the Bible that sometimes they would even sacrifice their children. They would literally burn their children alive in the worship of this god. And God knows that it's all a lie, that this God is not a god, that Baal does not exist. So of course he wants to redirect them. It'd be crazy not to, wouldn't it? What about our idols? What about the things which we would put in God's place on his throne and live for? I think actually if you think about it, maybe we can touch aspects of them like a statue that you might have somewhere in an idol temple. But often the thinking patterns and the ideas are just as much lies as the cult of Baal. Think of the notion of the happily ever after. The notion of that perfect person who's going to make your life full of roses and happiness and going to skip off into the sunset and it's going to be wonderful. I think all of us know deep down that that is a lie. That if you build all your hope on anticipating that moment when you meet that person, then your real life begins. You'll live disappointment after disappointment after disappointment. If you think that career is everything and just to reach that next rung on the ladder is going to mean complete satisfaction, that everything is going to fall into place, that you're going to become the person you were always meant to be, you will experience one disappointment after the next, won't you? Because it's a lie. Just like the cult of Baal is a lie, the cult of career progression is a lie, and the cult of the happily ever after is a lie. The only thing which makes sense as the center of your universal mind is the God of the Bible, Yahweh. So number one, God redirects us because these things that we live for, they represent a lie, a way of seeing the world that just isn't true. Secondly, though, they are destructive. They're deeply destructive. I mean, we talked a little bit already about some of the examples from the cult of Baal. Any worldview that says you should burn your children in adoration of this god is a destructive worldview, isn't it? We don't know tons about what happened in Baal worship, but think about some of the other things you see with the false gods of the Old Testament. Do you guys know the story of Elijah when he's on Mount Carmel and there's this clash of the gods between Yahweh and these prophets? And how do they call on their God to help them? They start slashing themselves with stones. They're bleeding, and literally as their blood is falling down to the floor, as they are bleeding their own blood, you just see how destructive this way of thinking is. But the same is true of our more sanitized modern idols that we've been thinking about. You think of a politician who lives for power. Actually, the most important thing for him is securing and extending the reach of his power. What a destructive figure he'll be in public life. In the House of Commons, if that is the thing that drives him, as he deals with his constituents, as he makes promises on the doorstep, if power is all that concerns him, if that is God in his life, he will become a force for destruction wherever he goes. Maybe some of you have had the displeasure of living in a house with a member of the family for whom their job is their God. Career matters more than anything else. How destructive to a family, how destructive to relationships, how self-destructive it can be when your work and the pleasure of your boss and meeting those deadlines and exceeding expectations becomes all-consuming. The idols that we have are just as destructive, just as deadly. And finally, one of the other reasons why I think God is so serious about this, why he goes to all the effort of hedging them in and keeping them from Baal worship, is because actually Israel were meant to do something. I don't know if you realize this. Sometimes, because we get very kind of individualistic in the way that we read the Bible, we forget that Israel were all this time, the whole Old Testament, loads and loads of pages of the Bible, right? From Abraham onwards, they were meant to be doing something, and they were failing miserably at it all the way through. From Abraham onwards, God's people were meant to be the ones through whom he would bless the world. He would bless the nations. God was pouring his mercy and his love and his goodness into Israel so that it would flow out to everyone all around the world. That people of every nation, of every tongue, of every tribe would be blessed through God's people, Israel. But that only worked if they modeled for the people around them what it looked like to be these kinds of people, to have God at the center. And because they didn't, they failed catastrophically. They looked just like any other nation there in the Middle East at that time. And so they were failing in what God had given them to do. God's plan for salvation was stalling because of these people, Israel. So for all those reasons, and probably for many more, God intervenes and he kind of hedges them in and he moves them away from this worship of the Baal. And it seems like they're kind of on the right track. Do you see there? They say, we'll go back to our husband. But there's no change of heart there. In verse 8, you see that they still take all these things which God graciously gives them all the way through their disobedience. God is giving them grain and he's giving them oil and he's giving them all sorts of stuff that they need. And they use it for the Baal. They still take it back to the temple of Baal and they still worship there. So what does God do next? Well, look at verse 9. Therefore I will take away my corn when it ripens, and my new wine when it is ready. I will take back my wool and my linen intended to cover her naked body. So now I will expose her lewdness before the eyes of her lovers. No one will take her out of my hands. I will stop all her celebrations, her yearly festivals, her new moons, her Sabbath days, all her appointed festivals. I will ruin her vines and fig trees, which she said were her pay from her lovers. I will make them a thicket, and wild animals will devour them. I will punish her for the days she burned incense to the Baals. She decked herself with rings and jewelry and went after her lovers, but me she forgot, declares the Lord. If the last bit could have seemed petty, then this seems cruel, doesn't it? God is taking away their source of food. He's taking away their source of clothing. He's wrecking the land. Why? Why is God doing this? This seems harsh. It seems unkind. Well, it seems to me that this is actually the kind hand of God's discipline. Let me try and explain this to you. Baal was, they used to have gods for different things, okay? A god for this, a god for that. Baal was the god of fertility and the god of the harvest, amongst other things. He was an important god. And so every time they had a good harvest, what did these terrible Israelites do? They said, praise be to Baal. Praise be to Baal. Now, if they won't listen to the voice of Hosea, if they won't respond when God tries to redirect them, when he tries to put them back on the right track, a track that isn't full of lies and destruction, if he tries to make them flourish again, and they still resist, they dig their heels in and they will not listen, if they insist that all the good things in their life come from Baal, hurrah, 3 cheers for Baal, what does he do? He takes away his blessing. He takes away the harvest, the corn, the oil, the grapes, the wool, until there's nothing left. It's almost as though God is calling Baal out. He's saying, Baal, if you are real, prove yourself. If you are real, then do for these people what they think you can do for them. Give them their food, give them their water, give them their wine, give them their wool and their oil and everything else. And of course, Baal cannot answer because Baal doesn't exist, yeah? Remember? Baal does not exist. It's all a lie. And so the people are left to realize the hard way that God is the source of all these good things. That God, all the way along, through all their adultery, through all their turning away from him, through all the infidelity, was providing for their every need. You imagine that. A wife walks out on her husband, and years later, he's still paying for her. Years later, he still provides. Years later, he's still caring for her. That's the situation here. And so God pulls this all back in the hope that they will see sense, that they will realize that Baal has not provided anything. It was always the generous God that they had in the start. But of course, they don't listen, do they? You know, this happens to us. It's probably about a month ago now, I was preaching on this theme of discipline and exploring a little bit, we won't go into as much detail this evening, a little bit what happens sometimes when difficult circumstances come our way. Now, the Bible is very clear that if hard circumstances come your way, it isn't a guarantee that this is discipline. There's people in the Bible who suffer because they're being faithful. But equally, there are people in the Bible who suffer because they're apathetic or indifferent or disobedient to God. And his way of waking us up is to pull back the thing which we think is providing for our needs, the thing which we think is all important and will save us. And so sometimes when we lean really heavily on a job as the thing that's going to keep us safe, the thing that's going to provide for us, the thing that ultimately gives us meaning, gives me status and makes me the person I am, or we lean on our pension pot, or we lean on whatever it is, and it gives way, that's God's way of showing us that it isn't up to the job. And as we fall and we're about to hit the ground and he sweeps us up, it's then that we realize that he is the one who's the source of all these things. If it's a relationship which matters to you more than anything else, which you think will give you all the meaning and all the purpose that you desire, and it comes unraveled. I'm not saying it is, definitely, but it could be God's way of showing you that he needs to be your all in all, like we were talking about this morning. And so this happens, but even then, after he detours them, that's right, or after he disciplines them. I was thinking this could be a sermon with 3 Ds, detours, disciplines. You'd expect now destroys, wouldn't you? I mean, this is the moment when he goes all, hey Joe on us and grabs his gun, yeah? That's what you're expecting. And God's been putting up with them for centuries now. They're a waste of space. They're completely unrepentant. Here's the shock though. Look at verse 14. Therefore, I am now going to allure her. I will lead her into the wilderness and speak tenderly to her. There I will give her back her vineyards. I will make the valley of Achor a door of hope. There she will respond as in the days of her youth, as in the days she came up out of Egypt. This last section is a complete shock. And if we've watched any film about betrayal, if we've listened to any morbid country and western album, we know how this thing ends, right? It all ends bad. If the lover is spurned enough, he will give up and he'll kill somebody or something will go bad. That's just how it always ends. But not in the story of God. Because here, God says, you know what? I love you so much that even though when I try to reroute you, you just will not listen. Even though when I try to discipline you, you still turn away from me. Yeah, I will still love you. I am committed to you just as much today as I ever was. Let's take it right back to the beginning. All this language in these verses I just read to you remind us of the early days of their relationship in the wilderness after God took them out of Egypt. He mentions Egypt a bit later. That incident in the valley of Achor, you could look at that for your homework if you're interested, it is an incident from the early days of the people of Israel. And what does he say? He says, take this moment, the valley of Achor. You might have a little footnote. It says, Achor means trouble. This valley of trouble. God is saying, let's make this moment of trouble a door of hope. In this deepest, darkest season in your national life, open the door and step into the hope that I offer. God is reaching out to his people in love and in grace and in compassion and in mercy. He's offering a fresh start, a new beginning to these people who have let him down and cheated on him again and again and again. How great is his grace? How unbelievable is God's love? You know, I was thinking, I've been married a little while now, and the longer you are married, I think the more significant it is when you say to your partner, I love you. Do you think? I mean, it's very easy to say in the early days of a relationship, oh, I love you. But let 5 years pass and 10 years pass, 20, 30, 40 years pass. If you can still say sincerely, I love you, that means tons, doesn't it? And think about how right in the beginning, God is described. Back in the book of Exodus, God is described as the Lord, compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness. And that was a big deal back then. But the centuries have rolled on. And his wife, Israel, has been a nightmare. And she has been cheating on him left, right, and center with any God they could find. But still, we read in this passage that he is a God full of compassion, that he is a God full of grace, that he is slow to anger, that he loves them more deeply than they can ever conceive. And the same thing is true for us. People, this evening, if you have let God down, if you know that you have wandered, if you know that on purpose you've turned your back on him, in a moment of anger, you've said harsh words to him that he did not deserve. If you feel like you're on the brink of just leaving altogether, God is ready to start again with you. God is still the God of compassion that you came to when you first heard the gospel. And if you've never heard this message before, this is what the Bible is all about. A God whose compassion goes deeper than you could ever imagine, whose love and mercy stretches wider and higher than you could possibly conceive. So let's just see how this rolls out. Look at verse 16. It says, in that day, he is conceiving of a day when he will accept them back. In that day, declares the Lord, you will call me my husband. You will no longer call me my master. I will remove the name of the Baals from her lips. No longer will their names be invoked. In that day, I will make a covenant for them with the beasts of the fields and the birds of the sky and the creatures that move along the ground. Bow and sword and battle I will abolish from the land, so that all may lie down in safety. I will betroth you to me forever. I will betroth you in righteousness and justice, in love and compassion. I will betroth you in faithfulness, and you will acknowledge the Lord. In that day I will respond, declares the Lord. I will respond to the skies, and they will respond to the earth. And the earth will respond to the grain and the new wine and the olive oil, and they will respond to Jezreel. I will plant her for myself in the land. I will show my love to the one I called not my loved one. I will say to those called not my people, you are my people. And they will say, you are my God. All the themes and the undertones that we detected in that first little bit, do you remember? They're all completely subverted here. Just think, right at the start we were saying, That gruesome image, really, of a wife stripped bare is a husband or a community exposing her sin. It's a husband stepping away from a wife he wants nothing to do with. But here you have God saying, you are my husband, you are my wife, and I am your husband. You have God speaking to his people saying, you are my people, and I am your God. Whatever you've done, whatever water is under the bridge, I will stand by you. I will not leave you. My grace is so sufficient that it covers over anything and everything you have done. That's what he's getting at here. And that theme of the military fear, do you remember we picked that up in the kind of treaties between kings? He says here, I will create for you this land where there will be no need for bows or swords or battle or anything like that. You lie down without fear. There'll be peace, complete safety is the theme of that middle part. And then finally, that thought of a barren land which does not produce food or anything of any good. God says, I will respond. And the skies will respond. It's as though God's grace is kind of cascading down through the clouds onto the land, and life springs up from dead, dusty ground. I watched something a little while ago that made me think, which I thought of when I was reading these words. I want to show it to you. It's by a very talented student we had here called Emily Kimball. Most of you know Emily. She was baptized a couple of months ago in the sea by us. And she's an animator, and she created this. I just want to show you this because I think it's almost something like the vision which Hosea is trying to capture here. I don't think she was thinking of Hosea 2. I'll ask her, but I don't think so. But watch and see, and just capture something of the possibility of new life that Hosea is getting at. Vision which God is painting through the words of Hosea here for his people is of a possibility of new life. That his grace in liquid form in the imagery here will cascade down and will flood this barren space and bring life and vitality and future and possibility in a way that they could not imagine, in a way that would never be possible with Baal. Baal brings death and lifelessness. Anything else that you put in God's place will bring just the same. But open the door to God. Make this moment, perhaps that moment that you're in right now of trouble, that moment of hopelessness, make this an opportunity to step through God's door of hope, to step into the possibility that God offers to you, of grace, of forgiveness, of a new start, of all that came before wiped away. There might be some people here this evening who feel as though they've never done that. Some of us here are Christians, and we know that we need to turn back. We know that deeply. We know that weekly. We know that on an hourly basis. But some people here have never done that. Never. I want to invite you this evening to turn in faith to God, to realize that whatever you've been building your life on is not big enough to carry that weight. It will only lead to death and destruction and disappointment. But turn to God. Make this moment the moment that you step into his door of hope, as it were, of a possibility like that, of a future full of life, which only God can offer. And in the final book of the Bible, Jesus is talking to churches, and there's one church that has struggled and is in a very bad place. And he says this to them. He says, "Those whom I love, I rebuke and discipline. So be earnest to repent." To repent just means to turn around from where you are and to begin following Jesus. "Here I am. I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I will come in and eat with that person and they with me." This evening, God wants to extend exactly the same grace to you and me as he extended to the people of Israel back then. You may feel that you're not good enough for God. You may feel that you've accepted his grace before and messed up. You may feel that you're just too far down the track. But let me tell you, that is not true of anyone in this room. Jesus stands at the door of hope, and he knocks this evening. And if you will open the door to Jesus, you will experience life in all its fullness that only he can bring. So what will you do? Will you open the door to him? As you consider that question, let me just give a moment of quiet, and then I'll pray. And as we do that, maybe if the band could come up and join us on the stage. Father, we know that we are guilty, just like those people, Israel. We make other things, God, in your place, and they just cannot do your job. You alone are the creator. You alone are the sustainer. Lord, we praise you. We thank you because you alone are full of grace in the way we've seen in this passage. And so, Father, for some of us this evening, we come back to you again for the 1,000th time. We keep on failing, but you keep accepting us back. You are so full of grace. Or maybe for some here this evening, we come for the first time. We've heard Jesus knock, and we're opening the door to him. Lord, whether this is the first time or the 1,000th time, please help us all to open the door, to receive the grace that is only possible through your Son, Jesus, and to step into your door of hope, the hope of a new life, the hope of a fresh start, the hope of a future flooded with the abundant grace that you give. Amen.